The crystal chandelier above the Jenkins family dining table glittered like something out of a luxury magazine, but Jodie Jenkins could barely breathe beneath it. Across from her, Vanessa Carter laughed with her hand resting far too comfortably on Corey's wrist while his mother pretended not to notice. Then Corey smirked and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Jodie's always smiling lately. Guess being spoiled suits her." The table laughed, softly. Vanessa tilted her head. "Seriously, Jodie, why are you still smiling?" Jodie slowly folded her napkin, lifted her eyes, and smiled even wider. "I'm not happy," she said calmly. "I'm patient." Then she slid a thick manila envelope onto the table, and Corey's face lost all its color. If you've ever stayed quiet while someone underestimated you, this story will hit differently. Watch until the end, because some people only understand your value after they destroy everything trying to replace you. 3 years earlier, before the silence, before the humiliation, before Vanessa Carter started wearing Jodie's favorite perfume around Corey, like a victory flag, people used to call them the perfect couple. Jodie Jenkins almost laughed whenever she remembered that now. Perfect. That word had nearly destroyed her life. The first apartment she and Corey shared in Boston had peeling paint near the kitchen window and radiators that screamed through winter nights like dying animals. Corey had been 28, ambitious, charming, and broke. Jodie had been the stable one back then. She worked at a boutique branding agency, while Corey spent endless nights trying to turn his logistics startup into something investors would actually take seriously. She used to stay awake beside him at 2 in the morning, correcting his pitch decks while he paced barefoot across their apartment floor. "No investor is going to read 27 slides," she'd tell him gently. Corey would groan dramatically. "You're killing my artistic vision." "You don't have an artistic vision, you have a panic attack in PowerPoint form." And he'd laugh. Back then, he really laughed with her, not at her. Jodie remembered the night his first investor agreed to meet them in Manhattan. Corey had nearly thrown up from nerves before dinner. His tie had been crooked. His hands shook so badly he dropped water all over the restaurant tablecloth. So Jodie stepped in. She smiled through the meeting, guided the conversation, reframed Corey's chaotic ideas into something elegant and profitable. By dessert, the investor was nodding slowly while Corey looked at Jodie like she'd hung the moon itself. Later that night, Corey grabbed her face outside Grand Central Station and whispered, "When we make it, none of this happens without you." Jodie had believed him. That was the dangerous part. She had believed every word. Over the next 7 years, Corey Jenkins became exactly the kind of man magazines loved to photograph. Luxury watches, private golf clubs, Forbes interviews, panel discussions, expensive navy suits tailored so perfectly they looked painted onto his body. Meanwhile, Jodie slowly disappeared inside his success story. It happened so gradually, she barely noticed. First, she left her agency job temporarily to help Corey prepare for expansion. Then she started organizing investor dinners because nobody handles people better than you, babe. Then she began managing their entire social image, smoothing over conflicts, hosting clients, planning events, handling charity appearances, remembering birthdays, calming angry partners, coaching Corey before interviews. She became the invisible architecture beneath his empire. And invisible things are easy to stop appreciating, especially for men like Corey. The mansion in Greenwich should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like a museum where she wasn't allowed to touch anything. Every room looked expensive. Nothing felt warm. Corey barely came home before midnight anymore. When he did, his attention lived inside his phone, always texting, always smiling at the screen, always turning it face down whenever she walked nearby. At first, Jodie tried to convince herself it was stress. Success changes people, she thought. Pressure changes people. But pressure didn't explain the emotional distance. It didn't explain why Corey stopped looking at her like a partner and started treating her like part of the furniture. One night at dinner, Jodie spent nearly 2 hours cooking sea bass because it used to be Corey's favorite meal. He took 2 bites without looking up from his emails. "This is cold." That was it. No thank you. No eye contact. No acknowledgement she'd spent the evening waiting for him. Jodie stared at him across the marble kitchen island, while something inside her quietly cracked. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes I feel like I don't exist anymore." Corey sighed, immediately irritated. "Can we not do this tonight?" "Do what? This emotional ambush thing." Her stomach dropped. Emotional ambush. That was what he called honesty now. Jodie looked down at her untouched wine glass. "I wasn't attacking you. You always say that right before you attack me." The cruelty in his tone shocked her more because it sounded casual, practiced, like he'd already rewritten their marriage inside his head and assigned her the role of unstable wife. He stood from the table, grabbing his phone and blazer. "I have another meeting." At 9:30 at night, Corey gave her a cold smile. "Some of us still work, Jodie." The silence after he left felt radioactive. Jodie sat there for almost 20 minutes without moving. Then she quietly carried both dinner plates into the trash. A month later came the charity gala, the beginning of the end. The ballroom at the Langham Hotel glowed gold beneath massive chandeliers, while wealthy executives floated through the room pretending they weren't drunk already. Jodie wore a black silk dress Corey once claimed was unfair to every other woman alive. That night, he barely looked at her in it. Instead, his attention followed Vanessa Carter across the room. Vanessa was younger than Jodie by almost 10 years. Sharp blonde bob, designer heels, the kind of polished confidence that came from knowing exactly how attractive you were. Jodie noticed Corey smiling differently around her, not politely, hungrily, and suddenly every lonely night started making terrible sense. "Jodie." Corey appeared beside her, holding 2 champagne glasses. "There's someone I want you to meet." The woman beside him extended her hand immediately. "Vanessa Carter," she said smoothly. "I've heard so much about you." Jodie shook her hand. The woman's bracelet caught the light. Silver. Tiny sapphire charm. Jodie froze. She knew that bracelet, because she bought it for Corey 2 Christmases ago. For one horrifying second, the entire ballroom seemed to tilt sideways. Corey noticed her staring. "Oh." He laughed casually. "Vanessa admired it one day, so I gave it to her." Gave it to her. Jodie forced herself to smile while nausea climbed into her throat. "That's thoughtful." Vanessa smiled sweetly. "Corey's incredibly generous." The way she said Corey's name made Jodie's skin crawl. Too familiar, too intimate. Then came the whispers, tiny fragments floating through conversations around the ballroom. "Are they finally together now? I heard his wife already knows." Honestly, everyone saw this coming. Humiliation burned through Jodie's bloodstream slowly like poison. Everyone knew. Everyone except her. Later that night, she stood alone near the balcony overlooking the city skyline, when Vanessa approached quietly beside her. "Beautiful party," Vanessa said. Jodie didn't answer. Vanessa sipped champagne calmly. "Corey told me you hate these events." There it was. The intimacy, the proofs. Corey wasn't just sleeping with her. He was discussing his wife with her. Their marriage had become entertainment for another woman. Jodie turned slowly. Vanessa tilted her head sympathetically, almost kindly, and somehow that made it worse. Then Vanessa leaned closer and whispered softly, "He said you'd never leave him." Jodie felt something inside her finally go still. Not broken. Still. Like the exact moment before a storm changes direction. Jodie didn't cry on the drive home from the gala. That was the strange part. She thought betrayal would feel louder somehow, more dramatic, like shattered glass or screaming or uncontrollable sobbing in a dark parking garage. Instead, it felt cold, like someone quietly removing oxygen from a room. Corey drove beside her through the midnight streets of Manhattan, with one hand lazily resting on the steering wheel, while jazz music played softly through the Range Rover speakers. He looked relaxed, comfortable, like a man who believed he had already won. "You were quiet tonight," he said casually. Jodie stared out the window at blurred city lights. "Was I? Mm-hmm." He smirked faintly. "You probably intimidated half the room." That almost made her laugh. The room wasn't intimidated by her. The room pitied her. They all knew her husband was sleeping with another woman, and they watched her walk around the ballroom smiling politely, like the last person informed about her own humiliation. Jodie folded her hands tightly in her lap. "You and Vanessa seem close." Corey didn't even tense. "She's part of the consulting team. She wears my bracelet." He finally glanced at her then, just briefly, then back to the road. "You're seriously upset about jewelry." There it was again. That tone. The subtle manipulation designed to make her feel irrational for noticing obvious betrayal. Jodie swallowed carefully. "You gave her something I bought for you." Corey sighed dramatically. "Jesus, Jodie." Her stomach twisted. Not because he was angry, because he sounded inconvenienced, like her pain was exhausting him. "She admired it one day," he said. "I was being nice. You used to say it was your favorite gift. And now we're fighting over a bracelet at 1 a.m. We're not fighting." "No," Corey muttered coldly. "You're spiraling." The word hit harder than she expected. Spiraling, as if her instincts were insanity, as if noticing emotional infidelity made her unstable. Jodie looked down quietly at her wedding ring. For the first time in years, it felt heavy. When they reached the mansion in Greenwich, Corey immediately headed upstairs while loosening his tie. "I have an early call tomorrow," he said, without looking at her. No kiss, no apology, nothing. Jodie stood alone in the enormous marble foyer, listening to his footsteps disappear upstairs. Then she heard his phone buzz, still downstairs. He'd left it on the kitchen counter. Her pulse slowed instantly. Corey never forgot his phone. Never. The screen lit up again. Vanessa. A photo notification appeared briefly before disappearing. Jodie stared at the device like it might explode. Every decent part of her told her not to touch it. Good wives respected privacy. Good wives trusted. Good wives didn't become paranoid women sneaking through phones at midnight. But another voice inside her sounded tired now. Tired of pretending. Tired of protecting a marriage Corey clearly stopped protecting a long time ago. Her fingers moved before she could stop them. The phone unlocked instantly. No password. Because arrogant men stop hiding when they think they're untouchable. The messages opened automatically. And suddenly Jodie couldn't breathe. "Vanessa, dinner was painful tonight. Your wife looks at me like she knows." "Corey, relax." Jodie notices nothing unless it affects her directly. Jodie physically flinched. Further down, Vanessa. "She's prettier than I expected." Corey, "Don't start." Vanessa, "You still sleep with her?" A long pause in the thread. Then Corey's response. "Only sometimes. Mostly out of obligation." Jodie stared at the sentence until the words stopped looking real. Obligation. 7 years of marriage reduced to obligation. Her vision blurred slightly, but she kept scrolling. Hotel reservations. Private jokes. Photos. One image nearly shattered her. Corey, lying shirtless in a hotel bed, smiling directly at the camera. Not the smile he gave reporters. Not the smile he used at networking dinners. A real smile. The kind he used to save for her. Jodie slowly lowered the phone. Her body felt numb, like grief had anesthetized her from the inside out. Then footsteps echoed from upstairs. She locked the screen instantly. Corey reappeared at the kitchen entrance. His expression changed immediately. "Why do you have my phone?" For one dangerous second, Jodie almost told him everything. Almost screamed. almost threw the phone directly into his face. Instead, she calmly placed it back onto the counter. "You forgot it." Corey stared at her carefully, suspicious, studying her face. "What's wrong with you?" The question nearly broke her. Not. What happened? Not. Are you okay? What's wrong with you? Jodie forced herself to meet his eyes. Nothing. His shoulders relaxed instantly, because he believed her, or worse, because he believed she'd tolerate anything. Corey grabbed the phone and walked upstairs again without another word. Jodie remained alone in the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed softly in the silence. Outside rain tapped against enormous glass windows overlooking the dark backyard, and something inside her shifted permanently. Not rage, not yet. Rage was hot. This felt colder, cleaner, like the death of denial. The next morning, Jodie woke before sunrise. Corey was still asleep beside her, one arm stretched across expensive white sheets like a man completely at peace. She stared at him quietly. How many nights had he returned from another woman's bed and climbed into hers, pretending nothing happened? How many lies had he spoken while looking directly into her eyes? For years, Jodie blamed herself for the distance in their marriage. Maybe she stopped being exciting. Maybe she became too emotional, too dependent, too available. But now she understood something horrifying. Corey needed her insecurity, because insecure women stay. Confident women leave. That realization sat heavily in her chest while she moved silently through the kitchen, making coffee. At 8:30, Corey entered wearing navy slacks and a fitted black sweater, already scrolling through emails. "You have lunch with the Harrington investors Friday," Jodie said automatically. Corey barely looked up. "Mm-hmm. And your mother's dinner Sunday." "Mm-hmm. The dry cleaning called about your tux fitting." "Mm-hmm." Jodie stopped speaking, because suddenly she realized she sounded like an assistant managing a stranger's life, not a wife. Corey finally glanced up. "What?" She studied him carefully. Perfect haircut, perfect watch, perfect smile, crafted for boardrooms and magazine covers. A man she helped build. A man who now treated her like background decoration. "Nothing," she said softly. Corey checked his watch. "I'll be late tonight. Business." He grabbed his car keys. "When did you become this suspicious?" Jodie almost smiled at that. Suspicious. Such a gentle word for what he'd done. Corey approached and kissed her forehead quickly. The gesture felt rehearsed, empty. "Don't wait up," he said. Then he left. Jodie stood frozen in the silent kitchen long after the front door closed. Finally, she walked upstairs slowly toward Corey's home office. She opened drawers carefully, tax folders, contracts, corporate files. Most looked ordinary. Then she noticed one locked cabinet near the desk. Her pulse quickened. Corey never locked anything before, which meant whatever was inside mattered. Jodie stared at the cabinet for a long moment. Then she quietly whispered to herself, "What else have you been hiding from me?" And for the first time since discovering the affair. She wasn't afraid of the answer. The first thing Jodie learned after betrayal was this. People became careless the moment they believed you were weak. Corey stopped hiding almost immediately after that night. Not because he grew honest, because he grew arrogant. And arrogance was always louder than guilt. 3 days after Jodie found the messages on his phone, Corey walked into the kitchen, talking to Vanessa on speaker while pouring himself coffee. He didn't even notice Jodie standing by the sink at first. "No, move the investor dinner to Thursday," Corey said casually. "Friday's impossible now," Vanessa laughed softly through the speaker. "Your wife keeping tabs on you?" Corey smirked. "She barely notices when I'm home." The words hit like a slap, but Jodie didn't react. That was new. Old Jodie would have frozen, cried, confronted him immediately. Now she simply rinsed her coffee mug slowly while Corey finally turned and noticed her standing there. His expression shifted for half a second. Not guilt. Calculation. Then he smiled smoothly. Morning. Jodie nodded once. Morning. Corey ended the call casually and walked toward her. You're up early. So are you. Big week. Jodie looked directly into his eyes for the first time in days. Seems like it. Something about her tone unsettled him. Very slightly. Not enough to alarm him, but enough that he studied her face an extra second longer. You okay? There it was again. Not genuine concern. Maintenance. Like checking for structural damage in a building he still intended to use. Jodie gave him a soft smile. I'm fine. And Corey relaxed immediately. Because men like Corey didn't fear emotional women. They feared silent ones. That afternoon, Jodie drove into Manhattan alone for the first time in months. Not for shopping, not for charity planning, not for one of Corey's endless networking obligations. For herself. Rain streaked across the windshield while she sat parked outside a small electronics store downtown, staring blankly through the glass. Her hands trembled slightly. Not because she doubted what Corey was doing anymore, because she was about to cross a line she never imagined crossing in her marriage. An hour later, she left carrying a digital voice recorder, a cloud storage backup drive, and a quiet understanding that her life had changed permanently. That evening, Corey returned unusually affectionate, which terrified her more than cruelty. Cruelty was honest. Affection from guilty people was strategy. He kissed her cheek while loosening his tie. You want to go to Napa next month? He asked casually. Maybe we both need a reset. Jodie nearly laughed. A reset, as if vacations repaired betrayal, as if luxury could anesthetize disrespect. Instead, she smiled softly. That sounds nice. Corey visibly relaxed again. He needed her agreeable, needed her calm, needed her predictable. Because predictable women never destroyed men publicly. During dinner, Corey talked endlessly about a new expansion project while checking his phone every few minutes beneath the table. Jodie watched him carefully. She noticed everything now. The tiny smile when Vanessa texted. The way he straightened unconsciously whenever her name appeared. The emotional energy he no longer gave his wife. You're distracted tonight, Jodie said quietly. Corey didn't look up from his steak. I'm working. At dinner, that's how companies grow. Jodie tilted her head slightly. And marriages. Corey sighed immediately. There it was again. Annoyance. Always annoyance whenever she needed emotional honesty. Can we please not turn every conversation into therapy? I asked one question. You always do this. Do what create problems where there aren't any. Jodie stared at him across candlelight and polished marble. The frightening part wasn't the lying anymore. It was how naturally it came to him. Like manipulation had become his default language. She reached for her wine calmly. What if there are problems? Corey finally looked at her directly. Coldly. Then maybe stop acting like a victim long enough to solve them. Silence filled the dining room instantly. Years ago, that sentence would have shattered her. Tonight, it clarified something instead. Corey genuinely believed her pain inconvenienced him. That realization stripped away the final pieces of illusion. Jodie nodded slowly. You're right. He blinked, caught off guard, because agreement wasn't what he expected. What? You're right, she repeated softly. I should stop acting emotional. Corey leaned back slightly suspicious now, but then Jodie smiled gently and changed the subject. And that frightened him more than an argument would have. Later that night, after Corey fell asleep, Jodie slipped quietly into his office, carrying the small voice recorder inside her sweater pocket. The locked cabinet still waited beside the desk. She crouched beside it carefully, then noticed something strange. One key missing from Corey's keyring on the desk. Her pulse quickened. She searched the office slowly until she found it taped beneath the bottom drawer. Careless. Arrogant. Untouchable men always became careless eventually. The cabinet opened with a soft click. Inside sat financial folders, offshore account documents, property records, and multiple contracts she had never seen before. Jodie pulled one folder free slowly. Her stomach dropped immediately. Her signature appeared on the final page, but she had never signed it. Another folder. Same thing. Another. Again. Forged signatures. Hidden transfers. Large sums of money moved through consulting companies she didn't recognize. Jodie's breathing became shallow. This wasn't just cheating anymore. This was something darker, something dangerous. Then she heard movement upstairs. Corey. Jodie quickly photographed documents with her phone before locking the cabinet again, just as footsteps approached the hallway. She slipped onto the office couch, pretending to scroll social media. Corey appeared in the doorway, shirtless, sleepy, irritated. "What are you doing down here?" "Couldn't sleep." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Why are the lights on? I didn't think it mattered." Corey stared at her for a long moment. Jodie forced herself to stay relaxed. Normal, small, non-threatening. Finally, he exhaled. "You've been weird lately." Jodie smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm tired too." Corey walked closer slowly. "You know I love you, right?" The sentence almost made her physically ill. Because people who loved you didn't dismantle your dignity behind closed doors. Still, she looked up at him calmly. "Do you?" He frowned immediately. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jodie held his gaze. Nothing. Again, that word. Nothing. It was becoming her shield. Corey leaned down and kissed the top of her head absent-mindedly before heading back upstairs. And Jodie realized something chilling as she listened to him leave. He no longer saw her clearly. Not as a woman. Not as a partner. Not even as a threat. To Corey, Jodie had become background noise. Predictable. Safe. Powerless. Which meant he would never see her coming. The next morning, Jodie sat alone in her parked car outside a discreet law office in Midtown Manhattan, Holloway and Pierce family litigation. Rain slid down the windshield while anxiety tightened her chest. She hadn't spoken to Grace Holloway in nearly 6 years. Not since Corey slowly isolated her from most of her old life. But there was only one person Jodie trusted enough now. One person sharp enough to understand what Corey really was. She stared at the building entrance for a long moment, then finally whispered to herself, "If he wants war, he's about to meet the version of me he should have been afraid of all along." And for the first time since the affair began, Jodie Jenkins stopped feeling helpless. The law office smelled like espresso-expensive paper and old power. Jodie sat stiffly in the reception area while rainwater dried slowly on her coat sleeves. Outside the windows, Manhattan blurred gray beneath February clouds, but inside Holloway and Pierce, everything looked sharp, controlled, precise, the exact opposite of her life. A young receptionist smiled politely. "Ms. Holloway will be with you shortly." Jodie nodded quietly, then stared down at her trembling hands. She almost left twice. Not because she doubted Corey anymore, because speaking the truth out loud would make it real. Affairs were horrifying enough when trapped inside suspicion and private grief. But once lawyers entered the room, marriages stopped being dreams. They became evidence. Jodie. The voice instantly pulled her backward through time. Grace Holloway stood near the hallway entrance wearing a cream pantsuit and dark red lipstick, her auburn hair swept neatly over one shoulder. She looked almost exactly the same as she had at Columbia Law 10 years earlier. Sharp eyes, sharp mind, sharp everything. Except now there was something harder in her too. The kind of hardness women earned surviving powerful men professionally. For 1 second, neither of them moved. Then Grace crossed the room quickly and hugged her tightly. "Oh my God," Grace whispered. "What happened to you?" That question nearly shattered Jodie immediately. Because Grace didn't mean physically. She meant emotionally. Jodie pulled back slowly, forcing a smile. "It's good to see you too." Grace studied her face carefully. No, she said quietly. Something's wrong. And suddenly Jodie realized something painful. This was the first person in years who actually looked at her closely enough to notice. Grace led her into a private office overlooking midtown traffic below. The walls were lined with framed degrees litigation awards and photographs with powerful political clients. Jodie sat carefully in the leather chair across from the desk, while Grace poured coffee into 2 ceramic cups. So Grace said, gently sitting down, "Start wherever it hurts most." That did it. Not dramatically, not loudly. Jodie didn't burst into tears or collapse emotionally like movies always showed. Instead, her composure simply cracked quietly around the edges, like glass under pressure. "He's cheating on me," she whispered. Grace didn't react, with shock, which somehow made it worse. "How long, I don't know. Do you have proof?" Jodie nodded slowly. "Messages, photos, hotel receipts." Grace leaned back thoughtfully, and financially Jodie frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Grace folded her hands calmly. "Men like Jodie Jenkins rarely betray in only one direction." The sentence sat heavily between them. Jodie swallowed. "I found documents, hidden transfers, contracts with my signature." Grace's expression changed instantly. Sharp now. Focused. "What kind of contracts, I don't know yet." "Did you sign them?" "No." Grace became very still. "Did Corey ever pressure you to sign paperwork quickly over the years?" Jodie blinked. "Actually, yes. Dozens of times. Tax forms, expansion documents, investment approvals. Corey always handled the details while she trusted him automatically." "Bring me everything," Grace said quietly. Jodie reached into her purse slowly and handed over photographs, copied financial records, screenshots, hotel receipts, and the recorded conversation from Corey's office. Grace reviewed silently for nearly 20 minutes. The longer she looked, the colder her face became. Finally, she set the folder down. "Jodie," she said carefully, "your husband may have committed financial fraud." The room suddenly felt too small. "What?" Grace slid one document forward. "This LLC transfer here? Your signature doesn't match your legal filing signature." She pointed to another page. "Neither does this one." Jodie stared blankly. Grace continued calmly. "And these offshore movements are structured strangely, almost like someone trying to shield assets before litigation." Litigation, divorce. The word landed like a gunshot. Even now, even after the cheating, the lies, the humiliation, hearing divorce spoken aloud made Jodie's chest ache. Because part of her still mourned the man Corey used to be. Or maybe the man she imagined he was. Grace softened slightly. "You don't have to decide anything today." "Yes, I do." Grace paused. Jodie looked down at her wedding ring. "He already decided," she whispered. Silence filled the office. Outside, sirens echoed faintly through Manhattan traffic below. Finally, Grace leaned forward. "Listen to me carefully. From this moment on, you say nothing to Corey. Nothing. You do not confront him emotionally again. You do not threaten divorce. You do not warn him." Jodie nodded slowly. "Why?" "Because men like your husband panic when control disappears." Grace's voice hardened. "And panicked rich men become dangerous." A chill ran through Jodie's spine. Dangerous. The word felt too extreme. Then again, so did infidelity once. Grace opened a legal pad. "I need timelines, accounts, company names, anything unusual." For the next hour, Jodie explained everything: the emotional distance, the secretive phone behavior, Vanessa late-night meetings, strange financial documents, Corey, moving money aggressively lately. Grace took notes rapidly, then suddenly stopped writing. "When did the transfers start increasing?" Jodie thought carefully. "A few months ago. Around the same time, Vanessa became more visible publicly." Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not coincidence." Jodie's stomach tightened. "You think she's involved?" "I think," Grace said carefully, "that your husband maybe using his affair partner to hide marital assets. The sentence physically stunned her, not because it sounded impossible, because it sounded believable, too believable. Grace stood and walked toward the office window thoughtfully. Do you know what the biggest mistake intelligent women make in marriages like this? Jodie shook her head. They assume loyalty exists where comfort exists. Jodie looked down silently. Grace turned back toward her. You built his life, didn't you? The question hit harder than expected, because nobody ever said that part out loud. Yes, Jodie admitted softly. Grace nodded once. I can tell. Jodie frowned slightly. How? Because men like Corey don't become polished alone. Grace gave a humorless smile. Some woman always bleeds behind the curtain first. That sentence lodged directly inside Jodie's chest. For years, she minimized her contribution, told herself Corey was simply more ambitious, more talented, more important. But now she saw the truth differently. She had carried enormous emotional weight quietly while Corey collected public credit. And somehow, society treated that sacrifice as natural, expected. Grace returned to the desk. You know what scares narcissistic men most? What a woman who stops begging for love. Jodie felt her breathing slow, because something inside her had already begun changing. The desperation was fading. The grief remained. But beneath it now lived something colder. Clarity. Grace slid a business card across the desk. This is a forensic accountant I trust completely. Use only cash if you contact him. No shared accounts. No family credit cards. Jodie stared at the card. Everything suddenly felt like espionage. How bad is this? Grace held her gaze carefully. If Corey's doing what I think he's doing, she paused. Very bad. Fear flickered briefly through Jodie. Then something surprising replaced it. Relief. Not because her marriage was collapsing, because she finally understood she wasn't crazy. Corey spent years making her doubt her instincts, her emotions, her intelligence. Now another powerful woman sat across from her, confirming the truth: she had been manipulated. And manipulation only survives inside silence. Grace walked her toward the office exit an hour later. Before Jodie left, Grace touched her arm gently. One more thing. Jodie looked up. Grace's voice softened. When this gets ugly, and it will, Corey's going to suddenly remember how much he loves you. Jodie's throat tightened painfully. Grace continued quietly. That doesn't mean he changed. It means he's losing. Jodie stood frozen for a moment, then nodded slowly. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The city streets glistened silver beneath weak afternoon sunlight, while taxis rushed endlessly through Manhattan intersections. Jodie stepped onto the sidewalk, holding the folder tightly against her chest. For years, she thought survival meant endurance. Now she understood something else entirely. Sometimes survival meant becoming unrecognizable to the people who underestimated you. And somewhere across the city, Corey Jenkins still believed his wife was too broken to fight back. That was about to become the worst mistake of his life. Corey Jenkins loved predictable women. Women who forgave quickly. Women who cried loudly but stayed anyway. Women who mistook survival for loyalty. That was why Jodie terrified him now, without him fully understanding why. Because she stopped reacting. And silence changes the balance of power inside a marriage faster than screaming ever will. 2 weeks after meeting Grace Holloway, Jodie stood in the massive walk-in closet fastening diamond earrings while Corey adjusted his cufflinks nearby. They were attending another corporate dinner in Manhattan. Another performance. Another night pretending their marriage wasn't rotting from the inside. You look nice, Corey said absent-mindedly. Jodie glanced at him through the mirror. It struck her suddenly how beautiful he still was. That used to matter more. Tall, controlled, elegant in the polished way wealthy men learned after years around cameras and boardrooms. But now all she could see was calculation hiding beneath charm. Thank you, she replied calmly. Corey studied her reflection carefully. You've been different lately. Jodie smiled faintly. Different how I don't know. He shrugged. Quieter. Because I stopped begging you to love me. But she didn't say that. Instead, she reached for her clutch purse, where a tiny voice recorder sat hidden beneath lipstick and powder foundation. I've just been tired. Corey nodded slowly, though suspicion flickered briefly across his face. Then his phone buzzed, and instantly his attention disappeared again. Vanessa. Jodie knew without seeing the screen. The shift in his expression always gave it away. Subtle softening, tiny smile, emotional energy. He used to look at Jodie that way once. Now he looked through her. The drive into Manhattan passed mostly in silence, while rain blurred across the windshield. Corey answered emails beside her in the back seat, occasionally muttering instructions to assistants through Bluetooth calls. Jodie watched the city lights quietly. Grace's words repeated endlessly in her mind. Do not warn him. Do not confront him emotionally. Let him underestimate you. So Jodie did exactly that. At the restaurant, Corey transformed instantly into the charismatic executive everyone admired publicly. He greeted investors warmly, shook hands confidently, touched Jodie's lower back possessively whenever introductions happened. The performance would have impressed strangers, but now Jodie saw it clearly. Corey didn't love appearances. He needed them. Without admiration, he collapsed inward. That realization became more obvious halfway through dinner when Vanessa arrived late. Every molecule in Corey's body changed the second she entered the room. Jodie noticed immediately. So did everyone else. Vanessa wore a fitted ivory dress with her blonde hair tucked elegantly behind one ear. She apologized dramatically for being late, while several executives stood to greet her. Corey smiled at her too long, too warmly. Vanessa finally reached the table. Sorry, traffic was insane. Then her eyes landed on Jodie. Oh, good, she said sweetly. You made it tonight. Made it. As if Jodie were optional inside her own marriage. Corey chuckled awkwardly. Vanessa's leading the Phoenix acquisition now. Jodie sipped her wine slowly. Impressive. Vanessa smiled. We've been working very closely lately. The double meaning hung openly in the air. Corey should have looked uncomfortable. Instead, he looked excited by the tension. That realization disgusted Jodie more than the affair itself. Some men didn't just betray women. They enjoyed watching women compete over them. Throughout dinner, Jodie listened more than she spoke, and listening quietly became incredibly educational, especially when arrogant people forgot you mattered. We'll move another $8 million before quarter close, Corey told one investor casually. Vanessa nodded. The consulting structure protects exposure nicely. Jodie's pulse slowed instantly. Exposure. Protects. Consulting structure. There it was again, the hidden financial language. She kept her expression relaxed while mentally recording every word. Later, while dessert arrived, Corey excused himself to take a call. Vanessa watched him leave before turning toward Jodie with unsettling confidence. You know, Vanessa said lightly, Corey says you used to work in branding. Jodie met her eyes. I did. That's cute. Cute. Not impressive. Not intelligent. Cute. Like a hobby abandoned after marriage. Jodie folded her napkin carefully. Corey built his entire public image using my branding strategies. Vanessa blinked slightly. For the first time, Jodie saw uncertainty flicker across her face. She never told me that, Vanessa admitted. Of course he didn't. Men like Corey rewrote history constantly. In his version of events, he built himself alone. Jodie smiled calmly. He leaves out a lot of things. Vanessa studied her now, with more caution. Good. The conversation shifted when Corey returned, but Jodie noticed something important afterward. Vanessa looked less comfortable around her now. as if she suddenly realized Jodie wasn't as broken or unaware as Corey described. That night, after Corey fell asleep, Jodie quietly moved through his office again. The room smelled faintly like whiskey and expensive cologne. This time, she searched deeper, carefully, systematically. She photographed bank statements, shell company filings, investor communications, offshore transfer records. Then she found a black folder labeled Post-Divorce Financial Strategy. Her hands froze instantly. Slowly, she opened it, and the world narrowed. Inside were projected settlement calculations, asset shielding timelines, property division estimates, even legal recommendations. One highlighted sentence nearly stopped her breathing delay separation announcement until offshore protections finalize. Jodie sat motionless in Corey's leather office chair while rage finally stirred beneath her calmness. Not because he wanted divorce, because he planned it strategically while still sleeping beside her every night pretending to be her husband. Another document listed liquidated accounts, redirected investments, hidden consulting payouts routed through Vanessa Carter Holdings, LLC. Vanessa wasn't just an affair. She was part of the financial scheme. Grace was right. Jodie photographed everything rapidly. Then one final page caught her attention. A private note written by Corey himself. Jodie will settle emotionally if approached carefully. Main priority is preventing reputational exposure. Emotionally. Like she was a psychological weakness to manage. Not a human being. Jodie closed her eyes briefly. For years, she thought patience meant enduring pain quietly. Now she understood real patience differently. Real patience meant knowing exactly when to strike. The next morning, Corey found her making breakfast in silk pajamas while sunlight poured softly through enormous kitchen windows. "You're in a good mood," he observed carefully. Jodie smiled while pouring coffee. "Maybe I'm learning not to take everything personally." Corey visibly relaxed. That one sentence alone reassured him enormously. Because emotionally manipulated people become easier to control once they start blaming themselves. He approached behind her and kissed her shoulder. "I miss this version of you." Jodie almost laughed. This version, meaning the quiet version, the convenient version, the non-threatening version. She handed him coffee calmly. "I've been thinking." Corey stiffened slightly. Dangerous words inside marriage. About what maybe we both deserve less stress. Corey's eyes narrowed carefully. "What does that mean?" Jodie smiled gently. "It means I want peace." The relief on his face was immediate, painfully immediate, because Corey interpreted peace as surrender. He thought she was emotionally retreating, accepting, preparing herself to tolerate betrayal quietly. And that misunderstanding would cost him everything. After he left for work, Jodie sat alone in the silent kitchen, holding her coffee cup tightly. Then she called Grace. "He's moving assets through Vanessa," she said immediately. Grace became quiet. "How much proof do you have?" Jodie looked toward the folder beside her, enough to destroy him. And for the first time since discovering the affair, the thought no longer scared her. The Jenkins family mansion always smelled like expensive candles and emotional dishonesty. Jodie noticed that the second she walked through the front doors Sunday evening, everything inside the house looked immaculate. Polished, hardwood floors, fresh white roses, crystal chandeliers, silver serving trays lined perfectly across the dining room. A beautiful environment designed to disguise ugly people. Corey's mother, Eleanor Jenkins, believed appearances solved everything, including betrayal, especially betrayal. "Jodie, sweetheart." Eleanor kissed the air beside her cheek without actually touching her. "You look thin." Translation: "You look unstable." Jodie smiled politely and handed over the bottle of wine she brought. Traffic was terrible coming from the city. Eleanor barely acknowledged the comment before turning toward Corey immediately. "There's my handsome son." Corey grinned instantly softer around his mother. Jodie used to find that charming once. Now she saw how deeply Eleanor enabled him. The dining room slowly filled with familiar faces: Corey's younger sister Chloe, his older cousin Daniel, two longtime family friends, and several business associates. Corey often mixed into casual family gatherings. Everything about the evening felt strategic, curated, manufactured. Then Vanessa arrived. Not awkwardly, not apologetically, comfortably, like someone who already belonged there. Jodie watched the entire room react subtly. Daniel avoided eye contact. Chloe looked immediately uncomfortable. Eleanor remained perfectly composed, which meant one thing: they already knew. Vanessa entered wearing a cream cashmere dress and a smile polished enough to cut glass. "Sorry I'm late," she said lightly. Eleanor smiled warmly. "Oh, nonsense, dear. We were just getting started." "Dear." Jodie felt something cold move through her chest. Not pain anymore. Recognition. This wasn't just an affair. This was acceptance. Corey walked over immediately to take Vanessa's coat. Too quickly. Too naturally. Their fingers brushed briefly. Tiny moment, but intimate enough that Jodie noticed. So did Chloe. Corey's younger sister met Jodie's eyes across the room for one painful second and looked away immediately. Guilt. That expression told Jodie everything. Everyone knew. Everyone. Dinner began beneath soft jazz music and candlelight while servers moved quietly between courses. The entire table performed normalcy with almost impressive commitment. Vanessa laughed at Corey's jokes too hard. Eleanor complimented Vanessa constantly. Corey talked about business expansion while casually excluding Jodie from every meaningful conversation. It was psychological theater, and Jodie finally understood her role inside it. Humiliated wife, silent wife, replaceable wife. "So," Jodie Eleanor said suddenly while cutting into her salmon, "have you thought about getting back into working?" The question sounded innocent. It wasn't. Jodie looked up calmly. "I never really stopped working." A tiny silence followed. Corey sighed immediately. "Here we go." Eleanor smiled thinly. "Well, you know what I mean." "No," Jodie thought. "I know exactly what you mean. You mean paid work. Visible work. Male-approved work, the kind society respects. Not the invisible labor of building your husband's entire public life while sacrificing your own." Vanessa sipped wine delicately. "I actually think it's beautiful when women support their husbands full-time." The hypocrisy almost made Jodie laugh out loud. Corey smirked faintly beside her. Vanessa understands how demanding executive life can be. There it was. The comparison. Subtle, but intentional. Vanessa understands me. You don't. Jodie set down her fork carefully. And what exactly does Vanessa understand? Corey's jaw tightened slightly. Warning. He hated when she disrupted his carefully controlled atmosphere. Vanessa answered smoothly before he could. That ambitious people sometimes need flexibility from their partners. Jodie held her gaze calmly. Interesting. Vanessa smiled sweetly. I just think successful men carry enormous pressure. Chloe suddenly spoke for the first time all evening. So do successful women. The room quieted instantly. Eleanor gave her daughter a sharp look. Chloe. What? Chloe shrugged. I'm just saying. Jodie noticed the tension immediately. Unlike the others, Chloe looked genuinely uncomfortable tonight. Almost angry. Corey changed the subject quickly, launching into another story about company expansion while touching Vanessa's arm occasionally during conversation. Not enough to appear obvious, just enough to humiliate his wife privately in public. A calculated cruelty. And suddenly Jodie understood something terrifying about Corey. He wanted her to see it. Maybe not consciously, but emotionally. Yes. Because betrayal wasn't enough for people like him. They needed validation too. Needed proof another woman had won. Midway through dessert, Eleanor finally delivered the sentence Jodie would remember forever. You know, she said casually while sipping white wine, marriages survive a lot more when women learn not to overreact. The entire table went still. Corey stared down at his plate immediately. Coward. Jodie tilted her head slowly. I'm sorry, Eleanor gave her a patient smile. Men drift sometimes, especially powerful men, but smart wives understand how to preserve stability. There it was. Not advice. Permission. Permission for male betrayal. Jodie felt years of confusion suddenly reorganize themselves inside her mind. Eleanor didn't raise Corey, despite his behavior. She raised him for it. Because somewhere deep inside, this family male entitlement wasn't considered immoral. Only embarrassing if exposed, publicly. Vanessa remained quiet now, watching carefully. Corey finally spoke, softly. Mom? But Eleanor continued anyway. You've always been emotional, Jodie. Sensitive. Corey needs peace in his life. Peace. Always that word. Women were expected to swallow humiliation quietly and call it peace. Jodie looked around the table slowly. Nobody defended her. Not Daniel. Not the family friends. Not Corey. Only Chloe looked ashamed. Jodie smiled suddenly. And that smile unsettled everyone immediately. Because it wasn't hurt anymore. It was calm. Dangerously calm. I spent 7 years protecting Corey's peace, she said softly. Interesting how nobody ever asked what it cost me. Silence. Corey's expression hardened. Can we not do this here? Do this. Meaning, tell the truth. Jodie leaned back slowly in her chair. No worries. I'm done. But she wasn't. Not even close. Dinner ended awkwardly 20 minutes later. People scattered through the mansion pretending tension didn't exist. Jodie stepped outside onto the back terrace alone, cold night air brushing against her skin. The enormous backyard stretched into darkness beyond the pool lights. For a moment, exhaustion hit her hard. Not sadness, weariness, the kind that comes from surviving emotional disrespect too long. Then the terrace door opened quietly behind her. Chloe, Corey's younger sister, wrapped her coat tighter against the cold. I'm sorry, she whispered immediately. Jodie looked at her carefully. For what, Chloe's eyes filled instantly. For all of it. Jodie stayed silent. Chloe swallowed hard. I didn't know how bad it got. How long have you known about Vanessa? Chloe looked down. A while. The honesty hurt more than lies somehow. Jodie nodded slowly. Did everyone know? Chloe hesitated, which was answer enough. A bitter laugh escaped Jodie before she could stop it. Humiliation flooded her all over again. Entire rooms full of people watching her marriage collapse while smiling politely to her face. Chloe stepped closer. Jodie. Corey's changed. No, Jodie said quietly. He just got comfortable enough to stop pretending. The words hung heavily between them. Then Jodie's phone buzzed. Grace. One text message. The documents are ready. Jodie stared at the screen while her heartbeat slowed strangely, because suddenly everything felt clear. The betrayal, the manipulation, the performance, the years she spent shrinking herself to keep everyone else comfortable. All of it. Chloe studied her nervously. What are you going to do? Jodie slowly slipped the phone back into her purse. Then she smiled again. That same calm smile Corey kept underestimating. I'm going to be patient. And somewhere inside the mansion, behind them, Corey Jenkins was still laughing comfortably, with people who had no idea his entire life was already beginning to collapse. The final dinner started like theater. Elegant lighting, expensive wine, soft piano music drifting through the Jenkins mansion while people smiled too carefully at one another. Corey loved evenings like this. Rooms full of wealthy people admiring him, investors laughing at his jokes, women noticing him, Men respecting him. Validation everywhere. He had no idea he was walking into his own destruction. Jodie stood silently near the dining room entrance, smoothing the sleeve of her dark emerald dress while guests arrived one by one. She looked beautiful tonight. Not fragile, beautiful. Dangerous, beautiful. The kind of woman who looked calm enough to survive fire. Grace noticed immediately when she arrived. The attorney approached quietly beside her, holding a glass of champagne. "You ready?" Jodie stared across the room at Corey, laughing with Daniel near the fireplace. "No," she admitted softly. Grace nodded. "Good." Jodie frowned slightly. "Good. The women who should scare men the most are never the hysterical ones." Grace's eyes sharpened. "They're the calm ones." Across the room, Corey finally noticed them. His smile shifted instantly when he saw Grace. Tiny tension. Tiny alarm. Interesting. He approached smoothly, though his posture tightened slightly. "Grace Holloway." Corey forced a charming smile. "Didn't know you two reconnected." Grace smiled politely. "Small world." Corey glanced between them carefully. "What brings a shark divorce attorney to family dinner?" Jodie answered before Grace could. "I invited her." Corey's eyes flickered toward Jodie immediately. The air changed. Just slightly. Not enough for guests to notice. Enough for him to feel it. But then Vanessa entered. And Corey's attention disappeared again. Of course it did. Vanessa walked into the mansion wearing a fitted black dress that clung to her body like liquid silk. Eleanor greeted her warmly near the foyer, while several guests turned immediately to admire her. Jodie noticed the confidence in Vanessa tonight, the arrogance. She believed the war was already won. Poor thing. Dinner began 30 minutes later, beneath glowing chandelier light, while silverware clinked softly against porcelain. Jodie sat across from Corey. Vanessa sat beside him, not beside other executives, not across the table, professionally. Beside him, deliberately intimate, humiliating. Corey didn't object. Eleanor didn't object. Nobody objected. The cruelty had become normalized. Conversation floated around investment opportunities and luxury travel while servants refilled wine glasses quietly. Jodie barely touched her food. Not because she was nervous, because she was waiting. Corey leaned toward Vanessa halfway through dinner, whispering something that made her laugh softly. Too softly. Too personally. Then Vanessa noticed Jodie watching. Instead of embarrassment, she smiled. That smile said, "He chose me." Jodie smiled back calmly, and somehow that unsettled Vanessa more. "So Jodie," Vanessa said sweetly, "you've been awfully quiet tonight." Several people glanced up immediately. Corey took a sip of wine without intervening. "Coward," Jodie folded her napkin carefully. "Have I?" Vanessa tilted her head. "You're just smiling a lot lately." A few uncomfortable chuckles echoed around the table. Then came the sentence, the one that would destroy everything. "Seriously," Vanessa laughed lightly. "Why are you still smiling?" Silence, complete silence. Even the piano music from the next room suddenly felt distant. Corey looked mildly irritated now, probably expecting emotional drama. Tears. Accusations. A scene. That was the version of Jodie he understood. Not this one. Jodie slowly lifted her eyes toward Vanessa, then toward Corey, then toward the rest of the table, and smiled wider. "I'm not happy," she said softly. Every person at the table froze. "I'm patient." The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. Corey's expression shifted first. Confusion, then caution. Jodie reached beside her chair calmly and lifted a thick manila envelope onto the table. Vanessa's smile disappeared. Corey stared at the envelope immediately. "What's this?" Jodie's voice remained frighteningly calm. "Perspective." She slid the envelope across polished mahogany slowly. Corey didn't touch it. Neither did Vanessa. Grace sipped champagne quietly nearby without speaking. Eleanor frowned sharply. Jodie, enough theatrics. Jodie looked at her calmly. This isn't theater. Then she turned back toward Corey. It's evidence. Every molecule in the room changed. Corey laughed suddenly. Too quickly. Too loudly. Okay. He shook his head. What exactly is this supposed to be? Jodie opened the envelope herself. One by one, she placed documents onto the table, hotel receipts, offshore. Account transfers, photographs, forged contracts, shell company filings connected to Vanessa. The room became impossibly still. Daniel leaned forward immediately. One investor at the far end of the table removed his glasses slowly. Vanessa went pale first. Corey went cold second. What the hell is this? He snapped. Jodie met his eyes calmly. The truth. Corey's composure cracked visibly now. You went through my private documents. Private. Interesting word for criminal activity. Vanessa grabbed one paper quickly, her face drained of color. Corey. He ignored her completely. This is insane, he barked at Jodie. You're spying on me now. Jodie almost smiled. There it was. Not remorse, not guilt. Anger at being exposed. Grace finally spoke calmly from beside her. Legally speaking, financial fraud inside a marriage tends to become everyone's business. Corey's eyes snapped toward her instantly. And suddenly, he understood. Really understood. This wasn't emotional confrontation. This was strategy. His breathing changed. Shorter now. More aggressive. What exactly are you trying to do? He demanded. Jodie stared at him quietly. For years, she said softly, I thought silence meant weakness. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for their wine anymore. Jodie continued. But silence is also how people gather information. Vanessa stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. Corey told me everything was handled. Handled. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks immediately. Oops. Wrong sentence. Corey glared at her sharply. Vanessa. No. Vanessa's voice shook now. You said she wouldn't find anything. Jodie watched realization spread through the room like wildfire. Affair. Fraud. Asset hiding. Manipulation. Suddenly, the perfect executive image Corey spent years building began collapsing in real time. And the truly beautiful part. He couldn't control it anymore. His phone rang suddenly. Sharp. Violent against the silence. Corey glanced down, then froze. Jodie recognized the company number instantly. Board of Directors. He answered immediately. Hello, silence. Then his face lost all color. What do you mean frozen? Across the table, one investor quietly stood. Another followed. The emotional atmosphere shifted from discomfort to survival. Nobody wanted proximity to scandal now. Corey lowered the phone slowly. For the first time in years, he looked afraid. Real fear. Not irritation. Not annoyance. Fear. Jodie almost pitied him. Almost. What did they say? Eleanor whispered. Corey didn't answer immediately, because saying it aloud would make it real. Finally, he looked toward Jodie. Not arrogantly this time. Desperately. You reported me? Jodie's eyes never left his. No, she said calmly. I prepared for you. The sentence landed harder than screaming ever could. Vanessa grabbed her purse shakily. I'm leaving. Corey turned toward her instantly. Sit down. But Vanessa already looked terrified. Not loyal. Terrified. Because women who date married men often forget one thing: if he betrays his wife professionally and emotionally, eventually he betrays everyone. Jodie slowly stood from the table. Elegant, composed, untouchable. This wasn't a family dinner, she said quietly. She looked around the room one final time. It was a witness list. Then she walked away from the table while silence swallowed the mansion hole behind her. And for the first time in 7 years, Corey Jenkins realized he no longer controlled the woman he underestimated. The mansion sounded different after humiliation, quieter, like the walls themselves were listening. Jodie stood alone in the upstairs guest bedroom while chaos slowly unfolded downstairs beneath her feet. Muffled voices echoed through the house, Eleanor arguing sharply, Vanessa demanding answers, Corey shouting into another phone call, guests leaving too quickly. For years, Jodie imagined revenge would feel explosive, victorious. Instead, it felt strangely calm, like finally setting down something unbearably heavy. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Grace entered, carefully closing the door behind her. "You okay?" Jodie stared toward the dark window. "I don't know yet." Grace nodded slowly. "That's normal." Downstairs, Corey's voice suddenly exploded, loud enough to echo through the hallway. "Who leaked this?" Jodie closed her eyes briefly. "Not, why did I hurt my wife? Not, how did this happen? Who leaked this?" Reputation first. Always. Grace walked closer. "The board's already panicking," she said quietly. One of the investors forwarded everything to internal counsel before dessert ended. Jodie let out a soft breath. "It's moving fast." It needed to. Grace studied her carefully. "Do you regret it?" The answer surprised even Jodie. No. Not because she stopped grieving, because grief finally stopped controlling her. Another violent shout echoed downstairs. Then footsteps. Heavy. Fast. Corey. Grace immediately straightened. "Stay calm," she warned softly. The bedroom door burst open seconds later. Corey looked unrecognizable. His tie hung loose around his neck, eyes wild with panic and fury. The polished executive image had completely fractured. Good. Jodie remained seated calmly near the window. Corey stared at her like he didn't know who she was anymore. "What the hell did you do?" Grace stepped slightly forward. "Careful, Corey." He ignored her completely. "This is insane," he snapped at Jodie. "You humiliate me publicly, in front of investors." Jodie tilted her head slightly. Humiliate. Interesting word coming from him. "You humiliated yourself." Corey laughed harshly. "Oh, so now you're the victim." Grace spoke coldly. "She is the victim." Corey rounded toward her immediately. "Stay out of my marriage." Grace didn't blink. "Your marriage became legal business the moment you started forging signatures." Silence. Corey's expression changed instantly. Tiny crack. Fear. Jodie noticed it immediately. Good. That meant Grace was right about the fraud. Corey recovered quickly. "You can't prove anything." Jodie slowly stood now. For the first time in years, she looked directly at him without fear. "You really thought I'd never look closely at your life, didn't you?" Corey's jaw tightened. "You invaded my privacy." Privacy. Again. Men always called accountability invasion once consequences arrived. Jodie walked slowly toward him. "You moved money through your mistress. That's not what this is. You forged my signature. You don't understand corporate structures." The sentence almost made Grace laugh. Jodie stared at him quietly, and suddenly she saw him clearly. Not powerful, not brilliant, just deeply arrogant. A man so accustomed to control that he genuinely believed explanation alone could erase betrayal. Corey lowered his voice suddenly. Manipulative now. Softer. "Jodie, please." He ran a hand through his hair. "We can fix this privately." There it was. Not remorse. Containment. He still thought this was about public image. Grace crossed her arms. "She's not negotiating tonight." Corey glared at her. "I'm talking to my wife." Jodie's expression hardened slightly. "Your wife," she repeated softly. "Interesting title considering you introduced Vanessa to half of Manhattan before me." That hit. Corey visibly flinched, finally. A real emotional reaction. Not anger, shame, but only briefly. Then survival instinct returned. "You think destroying me is going to make you feel better?" he demanded. Jodie answered honestly, "No." That startled him more than rage would have. "Then why are you doing this?" "Because you would have destroyed me if I stayed quiet." The truth landed heavily between them. Corey opened his mouth, closed it again. Because he knew she was right. Downstairs, another front door slammed as more guests left the mansion. Corey looked suddenly exhausted, older. The illusion around him was collapsing faster than he could rebuild it. His phone buzzed again. He checked it immediately, then went pale. Jodie watched carefully. What happened now? Corey looked up slowly. The federal compliance team contacted the company. Grace inhaled softly beside her. That was serious. Very serious. Corey started pacing now. Fast. Uncontrolled. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. Everything was protected. Everything. Not the affair. Not the marriage. The assets. That was what terrified him most. Jodie suddenly felt something strange. Disappointment. Not because Corey betrayed her, because even now, at the edge of collapse, he still cared more about losing power than losing her. Corey stopped pacing suddenly and looked at Jodie desperately. "You could stop this." Grace scoffed immediately. "Oh, now she matters?" Corey ignored her again. "Jodie, listen to me carefully." His voice softened urgently. "People will come after everyone connected to this if it escalates. You included. Manipulation, fear tactics, still trying to control her emotionally." Jodie folded her arms calmly. "You should have thought about that before using my name." Corey's face darkened instantly. "You don't understand how ugly this can get." "No," she said quietly. "You don't understand that I'm not scared of you anymore." That sentence changed the room. Completely. Corey went still, because fear was the foundation of their marriage, not physical fear. Emotional fear. Fear of abandonment. Fear of conflict. Fear of losing him. Now that fear was gone. And suddenly, Corey had nothing left to control her with. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Chloe appeared hesitantly in the doorway. "Mom's asking everyone to leave." Corey snapped immediately. "Then tell her to handle it." Chloe flinched slightly. Jodie noticed. Interesting. Even his own family feared him emotionally. Chloe looked toward Jodie quietly. Something like guilt filled her eyes again. Then she disappeared downstairs. Corey rubbed both hands over his face slowly. "I can't believe you did this." Jodie stared at him, and for one heartbreaking second, she remembered the young man in Boston who once held her face outside Grand Central Station, promising they'd build a life together. That man was gone. Maybe he'd always been gone. "You know what the saddest part is?" she asked softly. Corey looked up. "I would have followed you through anything if you had just loved me honestly." Real emotion flickered across his face then. Pain. Actual pain. Too late. Way too late. Jodie continued quietly. "But you didn't want a partner." Her eyes sharpened. "You wanted someone loyal enough to betray safely." Silence swallowed the room. Corey looked wrecked suddenly. Not publicly. Personally. As if part of him finally realized this wasn't simply scandal anymore. It was loss. Real loss. But before he could speak again, his phone rang once more. This time, he answered instantly. "Yes, pause." Then his expression collapsed entirely. "But what do you mean?" Suspended. Grace closed her eyes briefly. "Board action." Corey lowered the phone slowly. "They removed my executive access." Nobody spoke. Outside the mansion windows, snow had started falling softly across the dark Connecticut night. Corey looked toward Jodie one final time. Not angrily now, desperately. And for the first time in years, he looked like the weaker one. Jodie held his gaze calmly. No screaming, no tears, no revenge speech, just truth. You should have been more patient too, Corey. Then she walked past him quietly and left him standing alone in the ruins of the life he thought nobody could take from him. 3 days later, Jodie Jenkins walked into the emergency board meeting wearing a navy brioni suit and the expression of a man still trying to convince himself he could survive this. Jodie almost admired the commitment. Almost. The headquarters of Jenkins Global Logistics occupied the top 17 floors of a steel and glass tower overlooking Midtown Manhattan. For years, Corey loved this building more than anything else in his life. More than honesty, more than marriage, maybe even more than himself, because inside these walls, people worshipped him, or at least, they used to. As the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, the atmosphere felt completely different. Quiet, tense. Employees avoided eye contact. Assistants stopped talking when Corey passed. Nobody smiled. Power disappeared faster than love ever did. Corey noticed it too. His jaw tightened slightly while he walked beside his legal team toward the boardroom. Jodie arrived separately with Grace 10 minutes later. She wore a charcoal gray suit, simple diamond earrings, and calmness sharp enough to terrify anyone paying attention. Grace glanced sideways at her while they entered the hallway. Nervous? Yes. Good, Grace replied. Means you still have a conscience. Inside the boardroom, 12 executives sat around a massive black conference table beneath floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked furious. One older investor looked physically exhausted. At the far end sat Harold Bennett, chairman of the board. He had mentored Corey for years. Today, he barely looked at him. Let's begin, Harold said coldly. Corey immediately stood. I think we should all take a breath before overreacting to personal matters being twisted into something corporate. Jodie nearly smiled, still controlling the narrative, still minimizing. Grace leaned toward her slightly. He's trying to frame this emotionally before the evidence starts. Classic narcissistic strategy. Harold folded his hands. Sit down, Corey. The tone alone changed the room. Corey hesitated, then slowly sat. Harold looked toward Grace. Ms. Holloway. Grace stood calmly and opened a thin black folder. What began as evidence of marital misconduct expanded quickly into evidence of potential financial fraud, executive misconduct, asset concealment, and misuse of corporate structures. The room went still immediately. One executive removed his glasses slowly. Another started taking notes. Corey laughed once under his breath. This is absurd. Grace ignored him. She distributed copies around the table, offshore transfer records, shell company structures, forged authorization signatures, consulting payouts connected to Vanessa Carter Holdings, LLC. Jodie watched the executives' faces carefully as realization spread. Confusion first, then anger, then fear. Because corporate men understood one thing above all else. Scandal destroys money. Harold looked up sharply. Corey, what exactly am I looking at? Corey leaned back, forcing composure. Standard asset protection structures. Grace spoke immediately. Using forged marital authorization. Silence. Corey's expression tightened. We don't know those signatures are forged. Jodie finally spoke for the first time. They are. Every eye in the room shifted toward her. Corey looked irritated immediately, like her speaking itself offended him. Interesting. Even now, part of him still expected silence from her. Jodie folded her hands calmly. I reviewed years of financial documents after discovering Corey's affair with Ms. Carter. She paused carefully. Several signatures attributed to me were fabricated. Corey scoffed. You're not a handwriting expert. Grace slid another report across the table. But this forensic examiner is... Harold's face darkened while reading. Another board member muttered softly, Jesus Christ. Corey's control started slipping visibly now. This is being exaggerated, intentionally. Grace remained calm. Would you also describe transferring company-adjacent funds through your mistress's consulting LLC as exaggerated? Vanessa shifted uncomfortably near the far side of the room. Unlike Corey, she looked openly terrified today. Her makeup couldn't fully hide how little sleep she'd gotten. Good. Jodie noticed Corey refusing to even look at her now. Interesting again. Cowards often abandoned their accomplices first. Harold turned sharply toward Vanessa. Were you aware of these structures? Vanessa froze. Every survival instinct inside her activated simultaneously, and Jodie suddenly understood exactly what was about to happen. Vanessa was going to save herself. Vanessa swallowed hard. Corey handled most of the financial side. Corey turned toward her instantly. Cold fury. Careful. The warning was quiet. Deadly quiet. Vanessa visibly panicked. I'm telling the truth. No, Corey snapped. You're protecting yourself. The room exploded into overlapping voices immediately. Executives arguing, lawyers whispering, Harold demanding order. Jodie sat perfectly still through all of it. For years, Corey controlled emotional environments effortlessly. Now he was drowning inside one. Grace leaned toward Jodie quietly. He's unraveling faster than I expected. Jodie watched Corey carefully. The terrifying part wasn't his anger. It was how quickly charm disappeared once consequences arrived. No warmth, no charisma, no confidence. Only entitlement stripped bare. Finally, Harold slammed a hand against the table. Enough! Silence crashed down immediately. Harold looked directly at Corey now. Did you or did you not authorize transfers through Vanessa Carter Holdings while concealing them from the board? Corey exhaled sharply. Everything I did benefited this company. That wasn't an answer. And everyone knew it. Harold's face hardened. That's not what I asked. Corey's voice lowered dangerously. With respect, this company exists because of me. There it was. The God complex. Jodie recognized it instantly. Corey genuinely believed success made him untouchable. Harold stared at him with something close to disappointment. No, the older man said quietly. This company grew because people trusted you. That sentence hit harder than shouting ever could. Corey looked blindsided by it, as if betrayal sounded different when directed at him instead. Grace stood again. There's another issue. Every eye turned toward her. She opened another folder. These communications suggest Mr. Jenkins intended to finalize significant offshore protections before initiating divorce proceedings. The room went silent again. Harold looked physically sick now. You were planning this. Corey rubbed his temples aggressively. My marriage has nothing to do with corporate operations. Grace's eyes sharpened. It does, when marital fraud overlaps with executive conduct and hidden financial movement. Vanessa suddenly stood. I want legal representation before answering anything else. Smart girl. Too late. Corey stared at her with open hatred now, and for the first time, Jodie saw fear flash across Vanessa's face, not because of the scandal, but because she finally realized what kind of man Corey truly was under pressure. Not loyal, not protective, predatory. Harold slowly removed his glasses. Then came the sentence Corey never imagined hearing. Pending full investigation, your executive authority is suspended immediately. Silence. Real silence. Corey blinked once. What? You heard me. This is temporary. Harold didn't answer. Because everyone already knew it probably wasn't. Corey looked around the room desperately now, searching for support, validation, someone loyal enough to stand beside him. Nobody did. Not one person. The isolation hit him visibly. Jodie felt something twist painfully in her chest. Not sympathy exactly. Grief. Because once upon a time she would have protected him from this room, protected his reputation, protected his weaknesses, protected his future. and he still betrayed her anyway. Corey stood abruptly. This is unbelievable. Harold's expression remained cold. No, Corey. He gestured toward the documents spread across the table. This is unbelievable. The meeting dissolved into legal discussion almost immediately afterward. Lawyers, compliance officers, risk management conversations. But Jodie barely heard any of it, because Corey was staring at her now, not angrily, not arrogantly, almost desperately, like he still couldn't understand how the woman he ignored became the woman capable of ending him. As she stood to leave beside Grace, Corey spoke quietly behind her. "Jodie." She paused. Didn't turn around. His voice cracked slightly for the first time. "You really want to destroy me?" Jodie closed her eyes briefly, then answered softly, "No." She finally looked back at him. "I wanted you to stop destroying me." And with that, she walked out of the boardroom while Corey Jenkins sat alone at the head of a table where he no longer had power. The courthouse in Lower Manhattan smelled like wet wool coats, burnt coffee, and exhausted people trying not to fall apart publicly. Jodie sat beside Grace at the long wooden table while reporters gathered outside the courtroom doors like vultures waiting for movement. 3 months earlier, that would have terrified her. Now, she barely noticed them, because once someone survived betrayal inside their own home, strangers became much less frightening. Grace reviewed documents calmly beside her. "You slept it all, a little? That's enough." Jodie glanced across the courtroom. Corey had just entered with his legal team, and for the first time since she met him, he looked diminished. Not physically, emotionally. The expensive suits remained, the polished haircut remained, but the certainty was gone. Powerful men carried themselves differently after public disgrace. Their confidence became brittle, forced, over-rehearsed. Corey noticed her watching immediately. For one long second, neither looked away. Then he crossed the courtroom slowly. "Can we talk privately?" Grace stood instantly. "No." Corey exhaled sharply. "I'm speaking to my wife." Jodie answered quietly before Grace could. "You lost the right to say that like it means something." The words visibly landed. Corey looked tired, suddenly. Deeply tired. "Jodie." His voice lowered. "Please." That word again. "Please." Funny how men discovered humility only after consequences arrived. Grace glanced toward Jodie carefully. "Your choice." Jodie stood slowly. 2 minutes. Grace nodded once, but remained close enough to intervene. Corey led Jodie toward the empty hallway outside the courtroom where morning sunlight cut sharply through tall windows. For several seconds, he said nothing, just stared at her, like he still couldn't process who she had become. Finally, he spoke quietly. "You look different." Jodie almost smiled. That was what everyone kept saying now. Different. As if survival physically rearranged women. "Why did you really want to talk to me?" she asked. Corey rubbed a hand over his jaw slowly. "They're talking criminal charges now. No apology. No regret. Straight to self-preservation." Jodie leaned against the wall calmly, and Corey looked genuinely frustrated. "How can you stand there acting like none of this affects you?" That question almost made her laugh, because for years everything affected her. His moods, his approval, his loyalty, his distance, his cruelty. Now suddenly he hated her calmness because he could no longer control it. "It affects me," she said softly. "Then why are you doing this?" Jodie stared at him carefully. And suddenly she realized something tragic. Corey still believed exposure was the betrayal. Not the cheating, not the manipulation, not the financial abuse. The exposure. "You really don't understand," she whispered. His jaw tightened. "Understand what?" "That this didn't start when I exposed you." Her eyes sharpened slightly. "It started the first time you looked me in the face and lied without guilt." Silence. For one dangerous second, real emotion flickered across Corey's face. Shame, maybe, or grief. But then survival instinct swallowed it again. You could still stop some of this. There it was, still negotiating, still strategizing. Jodie pushed away from the wall slowly. No, Corey, I stopped protecting you. Then she walked back toward the courtroom before he could answer. The hearing began 30 minutes later. Jodie expected anxiety. Instead, she felt strangely detached, like her body finally understood the war was almost over. The judge, Eleanor Whitmore, entered sharply and wasted no time with politeness. This court will now address financial concealment allegations, marital asset disputes, and claims regarding unauthorized signatures. Corey's attorney immediately stood. Your Honor, we strongly dispute the characterization of fraud. Grace interrupted smoothly. With respect, the documentation disputes itself. She handed forward forensic reports, transaction timelines, and financial records. Jodie watched Corey carefully while the evidence circulated. He looked angry, not remorseful, angry, because narcissistic people often experienced accountability as personal persecution. Grace spoke calmly to the court. For years, Mrs. Jenkins participated heavily in the branding and operational support of Mr. Jenkins's business ventures, while remaining financially dependent within the marriage structure. The phrase financially dependent echoed painfully inside Jodie's chest. Because it was true. Corey engineered dependence slowly, not through overt force, through emotional erosion, encouraging sacrifice, discouraging independence, making her smaller until she barely remembered her own ambition. Grace continued. We will demonstrate a pattern of manipulation involving hidden asset transfers, forged authorization, emotional coercion, and intentional attempts to financially weaken Mrs. Jenkins before divorce proceedings. Corey visibly stiffened at that. Emotional coercion. Interesting how much men hated psychological language once it applied to them. The judge reviewed several documents silently, then looked directly at Corey. Did your wife authorize these transfers? Corey's attorney answered quickly. We dispute the assertion that signatures were falsified. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. That wasn't my question. Silence. Corey finally spoke himself. Jodie trusted me to handle financial matters. Jodie felt something inside her go cold again. Even now, he framed trust as permission. Grace stood slowly. Trust does not equal consent. The courtroom went quiet. Reporters scribbled notes rapidly behind them. Corey suddenly looked toward Jodie again. And for the first time since all this began, he looked afraid of her specifically. Not lawyers, not investigators. Her, because she knew him too well. Grace called the forensic examiner next. A calm older man with silver hair who explained the signature inconsistencies, clearly professionally and without emotion. The signatures attributed to Mrs. Jenkins show measurable deviation patterns, inconsistent with authentic samples. Corey's attorney tried challenging the findings aggressively. The expert never wavered. Jodie barely breathed during the testimony. Not because she doubted the truth, because hearing manipulation translated into legal language felt surreal, like someone finally converting years of emotional pain into visible evidence. Then came the moment that shattered Corey completely. Grace approached the bench calmly, holding one final folder. Your Honor, we'd also like to introduce communications recovered from Mr. Jenkins's private records. Corey immediately stood. Objection. Grace remained calm. These communications directly establish intent regarding pre-divorce financial concealment. The judge accepted the documents. And then Grace read aloud, Jodie will settle emotionally if approached carefully. Main priority is preventing reputational exposure. Silence detonated through the courtroom. Even Corey's attorney looked uncomfortable now. Jodie didn't look at Corey immediately, because she didn't need to. She already knew his expression. Panic. The judge removed her glasses slowly. "Mr. Jenkins," she said coldly, "did you write this?" Corey hesitated. Too long. The hesitation answered everything. "Yes," he said quietly. The courtroom shifted instantly. That one admission changed the emotional atmosphere completely. No longer misunderstanding. No longer marital conflict. Manipulation. Calculated manipulation. Judge Whitmore's voice sharpened. "So you knowingly anticipated emotional leverage during divorce strategy." Corey looked trapped now. "That's not what I meant." "Then explain what you meant." He couldn't, because there was no clean explanation for reducing your wife's emotional pain into strategic management language. The judge leaned back slowly. "This court takes financial deception and coercive behavior extremely seriously." Jodie finally looked at Corey then, and what she saw shocked her. Not anger, collapse. The realization that he was losing control publicly in a room full of people who now saw him clearly. No charm left, no image left, just consequences. When the hearing finally adjourned hours later, reporters flooded the courthouse steps instantly. Grace shielded Jodie carefully while cameras flashed everywhere. "Mrs. Jenkins, did you know about the affair? Did Corey Jenkins forge your signatures? Are criminal charges expected?" Jodie ignored them all until one female reporter shouted, "What would you say to women trapped in marriages like yours?" Jodie stopped walking. The entire crowd quieted instantly. For a second, she thought about every lonely night she spent believing silence was strength. Every moment, she doubted her instincts. Every time Corey convinced her she was too emotional. Then she answered softly, "Love shouldn't require you to disappear." The crowd fell silent. And somewhere behind her, inside the courthouse, Corey Jenkins heard the woman he underestimated finally tell the truth without fear. Vanessa Carter learned very quickly that luxury disappears faster than shame. 2 weeks after the courthouse hearing, her life began collapsing publicly in ways no designer handbag or rooftop cocktail party could hide. People stopped returning her calls first. That was the beginning. Subtle, quiet, brutal. Women who once begged Vanessa for lunch reservations suddenly became too busy. Executives who flirted with her shamelessly at charity galas now avoided standing beside her in public. Because affairs looked glamorous only before consequences arrived. Afterward, nobody wanted proximity to scandal. Vanessa sat alone inside a nearly empty restaurant in Tribeca, staring at her untouched martini while her phone remained painfully silent on the table. 3 missed calls, all from reporters, none from friends. Across the television mounted behind the bar, financial analysts discussed Corey Jenkins's suspension from Jenkins Global Logistics. A headline crawled across the screen, "Executive Misconduct Investigation Continues." Vanessa looked away immediately. The bartender lowered the volume awkwardly after recognizing her. Humiliation burned hotter when people pitied you quietly. Her phone finally buzzed. For one hopeful second, she thought it might be Corey. It wasn't. Her landlord. Payment reminder. Vanessa laughed once under her breath. Sharp. Bitter. Because Corey promised she would never have to worry about money again. Funny how married men made forever sound so convincing while lying. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, Jodie sat inside Grace Holloway's office reviewing updated financial reports. Grace flipped through pages carefully. "He's bleeding money now." Jodie frowned slightly. "What changed legal containment?" Grace leaned back. "Investigations scare investors. Investors scare banks." Jodie stared quietly out the office window. She should have felt victorious. Instead, she mostly felt tired. There was no celebration in watching someone self-destruct, especially someone you once loved enough to build your future around. Grace studied her carefully. "You still pity him?" Jodie looked down. "Sometimes." Grace nodded once. "That'll fade. Maybe. Maybe not. Because heartbreak didn't vanish just because justice arrived. A soft knock interrupted them. Grace's assistant stepped inside carefully. "There's someone here asking for Jodie." Jodie frowned. "Who?" The assistant hesitated. "Vanessa Carter." Silence filled the office instantly. Grace looked ready to refuse immediately. "I can send her away." But Jodie surprised herself. "No." She stood slowly. "Let her in." Vanessa entered 2 minutes later, looking nothing like the polished woman from the gala. No designer confidence, no elegant cruelty, no victorious smile. She looked exhausted. Human. Interesting how quickly arrogance collapsed once validation disappeared. Vanessa stood awkwardly near the doorway, clutching her purse too tightly. "I won't stay long." Grace crossed her arms coldly. "Good." Vanessa ignored her and looked directly at Jodie. "I owe you the truth." Jodie remained calm. "That's new." The comment landed harder than intended. Vanessa flinched visibly. "Good." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Vanessa exhaled shakily. "Corey lied to me too." Grace nearly laughed. "Oh, what a shock." Vanessa's eyes flashed briefly. "You think I don't know how this looks?" "You slept with a married man?" Grace replied coldly. "It looks exactly how it is." Vanessa swallowed hard. Jodie finally intervened quietly. "Why are you here?" Vanessa looked at her, and for the first time, Jodie saw genuine shame there. Not performance, not manipulation. Real shame. "Because I didn't know how far he planned to go." Jodie's stomach tightened slightly. "What do you mean?" Vanessa slowly opened her purse and removed several printed emails. "I thought he was just protecting assets before divorce." Grace immediately stepped forward and took the documents. The longer she read, the colder her expression became. "Oh my God." Jodie's pulse quickened. What Grace handed over the pages silently. Jodie scanned quickly, then froze. Email after email detailed Corey's strategy, shifting offshore accounts, limiting Jodie's access, protecting executive reputation, controlling settlement optics. Then came the sentence that nearly stopped her breathing. "She's emotionally dependent enough to fold once pressure starts." Jodie stared at the words numbly. Emotionally dependent. Like she was a behavioral pattern. Not a wife. Vanessa's voice shook slightly. "He told me you were fragile. That you'd never fight him." Jodie looked up slowly. "And you believed him?" Vanessa's eyes filled instantly. "Yes." Honest answer. Painfully honest. Grace continued reading. Then another line caught her attention. "You plan to leave me financially ruined?" Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. "He said it was temporary." Jodie laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because betrayal sounded absurd once spoken aloud plainly. Vanessa sat down slowly across from her. "You want to know the worst part?" Jodie didn't answer. Vanessa's voice cracked. "I thought I was different." There it was. The fantasy. Affair partners always believed they were exceptions, special enough to inspire loyalty in disloyal men. Vanessa stared at her hands. "He made me feel chosen." Jodie felt something painful twist in her chest, unexpectedly, because she understood that feeling too. Years ago, Corey made her feel chosen too. That was his gift. Not love. Selection. Grace placed the emails down carefully. "These help us enormously." Vanessa nodded weakly. "I figured." Then she looked toward Jodie again. "I know you hate me." Jodie considered the question honestly. Did she? At first, yes. Vanessa represented humiliation, replacement, mockery. But now? Now Vanessa mostly looked like another woman Corey manipulated differently. "You participated willingly," Jodie said quietly. Vanessa nodded immediately. "I know. You enjoyed hurting me." More silence. then another nod. Yes, at least she wasn't lying anymore. Jodie leaned back slowly. Why Vanessa laughed bitterly through tears. Because he made me feel powerful. That answer echoed through the room painfully. Grace looked disgusted. Jodie just looked sad. Because women destroying each other for male validation was one of the oldest tragedies in existence. Vanessa wiped at her eyes quickly. He told me you stopped loving him. Jodie almost smiled. No, she whispered. I just stopped disappearing fast enough for him. Vanessa looked shattered by that sentence. Good. She should be. The office remained quiet for a long moment before Vanessa finally stood again. There's one more thing, she said softly. Grace narrowed her eyes. What Vanessa hesitated, then looked directly at Jodie. He was planning to propose after the divorce. The sentence barely affected Jodie at all anymore. That surprised her most. Weeks ago, it would have destroyed her. Now it just sounded pathetic. Because Corey didn't love deeply enough for forever. He consumed admiration. That was different. Vanessa pulled her coat tighter. I'm sorry, she whispered. Jodie studied her carefully and realized something important. Vanessa already lost. Not because of money, because she finally saw the truth. If a man betrays loyalty to gain you, eventually, he betrays you too. As Vanessa walked toward the office door, Jodie spoke one final time. Vanessa. She turned slowly. Jodie's voice remained calm. One day, stop measuring your worth by whether a damaged man chooses you. Tears filled Vanessa's eyes instantly. Then she left quietly. Grace exhaled sharply the second the door closed. She almost got sympathy from me. She shook her head. Almost. Jodie stared down at Corey's emails silently, emotionally dependent enough to fold. Funny. Because the woman Corey described in those messages no longer existed. And somewhere across Manhattan, Corey Jenkins still hadn't realized the biggest thing he lost wasn't his company. It was the version of Jodie who would have forgiven him. The mansion felt enormous without Corey's noise inside it. No phone calls echoing through hallways. No sharp footsteps at midnight. No forced charm filling empty rooms. Just silence. Jodie stood alone in the kitchen one gray Sunday morning, holding a coffee mug while winter sunlight stretched weakly across marble countertops. For years, she dreamed about peace. Now that she finally had it, the quiet almost hurt. Because healing was strange that way. People imagined freedom felt immediate, but sometimes freedom arrived carrying grief in both hands. The divorce proceedings were still ongoing, though the outcome already felt inevitable. Corey had moved into a luxury condo downtown after media pressure intensified around the investigation. The mansion belonged mostly to shadows now. Jodie wandered through rooms slowly like someone exploring ruins of a former life. Their former life. A framed wedding photo still sat near the staircase. She paused in front of it. Corey looked impossibly young there. So did she. They were laughing at something the photographer said moments before the picture was taken. Real laughter. Real happiness. That part hurt most. Not every memory was fake. That would have been easier. Jodie picked up the frame carefully. She remembered that day vividly, the ocean air in Nantucket Corey, crying during vows, his hands shaking while placing the ring on her finger, the way he whispered afterward. "You're my home?" Tears finally filled her eyes, not because she wanted him back, because mourning the death of a dream still counted as grief. Slowly, she turned the frame face down, then walked away. Upstairs, the master bedroom looked untouched since Corey left. His side of the closet remained half empty, now expensive hangers spaced awkwardly apart where his suits once hung. Jodie sat carefully at the edge of the bed, and suddenly the exhaustion hit. Months of betrayal, fear, courtrooms, public humiliation, emotional survival. She finally broke then. Not elegantly, not cinematically. Real grief was uglier than movies. Jodie buried her face in both hands while sobs tore through her chest hard enough to leave her breathless. For years, she swallowed every emotion quietly to preserve peace. Now, there was nobody left to perform strength for. So she cried for all of it, the marriage, the manipulation, the loneliness, the woman she abandoned becoming someone Corey could love comfortably. When the tears finally slowed nearly an hour later, Jodie lay staring blankly at the ceiling while silence wrapped around the room again. Then something unexpected happened. Relief. Tiny, fragile, but real. Because beneath the grief lived another truth: she no longer had to earn love by disappearing. That realization changed everything. Later that afternoon, Jodie wandered into the storage room beside Corey's old office searching for spare photo boxes. Instead, she found something else. An old cardboard container labeled Jodie Columbia. Her heartbeat slowed. She hadn't opened that box in nearly a decade. Dust coated the lid lightly when she carried it downstairs into the living room and opened it carefully across the coffee table. Inside sat pieces of herself she barely remembered: college notebooks, branding portfolios, photography prints, handwritten business plans, old acceptance letters. Jodie picked up one leather notebook slowly. Inside were pages filled with marketing concepts, creative campaign sketches, and business ideas, written entirely in her handwriting. Confident handwriting, ambitious handwriting, not the exhausted, careful version she used now. One page caught her attention immediately. Future goals. Before 35 launch independent branding firm. Travel internationally. Mentor young women entering business. Publish creative work. Never shrink for love. Jodie stared at the final line for a very long time. Never shrink for love. A broken laugh escaped her throat, because that was exactly what she spent 7 years doing: shrinking, making herself emotionally smaller so Corey could feel larger. She closed the notebook slowly while emotion tightened her chest again. Not sadness this time, recognition. Somewhere along the way, she stopped building a life and started maintaining Corey's. Her phone buzzed softly beside her. "Grace, you alive?" Jodie smiled faintly and answered. "Barely." Grace laughed softly through the speaker. "That's progress." Jodie leaned back against the couch. "I found old journals today, and I forgot who I used to be." Silence lingered briefly. Then Grace spoke gently. "No, you survived long enough to become her again." The sentence hit harder than expected. Jodie looked around the massive living room slowly. For years, this house represented success. Now it looked more like evidence. Evidence of how easily beautiful lives became emotional prisons. "You know what's weird?" Jodie said quietly. "What I thought winning would feel louder." Grace's voice softened. "Peace usually isn't." After the call ended, evening, shadows slowly filled the house. Jodie carried several old notebooks upstairs and placed them across the bed. She spent hours reading forgotten pieces of herself, creative ideas, college essays, travel dreams, half-finished business concepts. The woman in those pages felt vibrant, fearless, alive. Not because she had never been hurt, because she still believed her life belonged to her. Around midnight, Jodie finally walked into the bathroom and stood before the mirror. For a long moment, she simply looked at herself honestly. No performance, no pretending, no wife role, just a woman rebuilding herself from emotional wreckage. Then her eyes drifted toward the wedding ring, still resting on her finger. Funny. After everything Corey did, she still hadn't removed it. Maybe part of her believed taking it off would erase every good memory too. But that wasn't true. Love existed. It simply stopped being enough. Jodie slowly twisted the ring free. Her hand trembled slightly, not from doubt, from finality. The diamond caught soft bathroom light as she held it in her palm. 7 years. Thousands of sacrifices. a lifetime she once thought permanent. Then quietly, gently, she placed the ring inside the drawer and closed it. No dramatic speech, no rage, just release. The next morning, sunrise spilled gold across the mansion windows while snow melted quietly outside. Jodie stood barefoot in the kitchen, holding coffee again. But something felt different now. Lighter. Not healed. Not yet. But lighter. For the first time in years, the future no longer looked like something she had to survive. And somewhere deep inside herself, the woman Jodie Jenkins almost erased had finally started coming home again. 6 months later, Manhattan looked different to Jodie. Not softer, not kinder, just clearer. She no longer moved through the city feeling invisible. That was the difference. The office of Jenkins and Holloway Recovery Consulting occupied the 23rd floor of a renovated building in Soho, with exposed brick walls, tall industrial windows, and warm lighting that made people feel safe the second they entered. Jodie designed it that way intentionally. No cold marble, no intimidating glass, no corporate emptiness. Women arrived there already emotionally exhausted. The last thing they needed was another room designed to make them feel small. A young receptionist stepped into Jodie's office smiling. "Your 1 o'clock is here." Jodie nodded, closing the file in front of her. "Send her in." Moments later, a nervous woman in her 40s entered, clutching a leather handbag tightly against her chest. "Divorce client." Jodie recognized the look immediately. Humiliation mixed with confusion. The expression women wore when betrayal made them question their own reality. "Hi," the woman said softly. "I'm Rebecca." Jodie stood and shook her hand warmly. "I'm Jodie." Rebecca looked around the office nervously. "I saw your interview online." Jodie smiled, faintly. "The interview. Funny how public pain became inspiration once people survived it visibly enough. You said something that stayed with me," Rebecca continued quietly. "You said emotional manipulation makes intelligent women doubt themselves." Jodie nodded slowly. "Because it does." Rebecca's eyes filled instantly. "My husband keeps saying I'm overreacting." There it was again. The universal language of emotional control. Jodie gently gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Sit," she said softly. "Start wherever it hurts most." And suddenly, Jodie understood something powerful. Her pain had not disappeared. It transformed into wisdom, into boundaries, into something useful. Later that evening, Grace entered Jodie's office carrying takeout containers and 2 coffees. "You forgot lunch again." Jodie smiled. "You sound married." "Trauma bond." "Different thing." Jodie laughed for real. That still felt new sometimes. Real laughter. Not strategic politeness. Grace sat across from her desk, glancing around proudly. "You know this place is becoming impossible to book now." Jodie shook her head. "Still weird hearing that." "It shouldn't be." Grace leaned back. "You built something people actually need." Jodie stared thoughtfully at the city skyline outside her office windows. For years, she built Corey's world quietly behind the scenes. Now, she was finally building her own. The company had started small financial recovery consulting, emotional support referrals, legal strategy partnerships for manipulated spouses. But demand exploded quickly after Jodie's public court statements circulated online. Women trusted her because she spoke like someone who survived it herself, because she had. Grace studied her carefully while opening soy sauce packets. "You look happy." Jodie considered that honestly. Not happy exactly. Whole. That felt more important. Her phone buzzed suddenly across the desk. Unknown number. Jodie almost ignored it. Then answered, "Hello," silence. Then Corey's voice. Soft, unsteady. "Hey." The entire room changed instantly. Not dramatically. Subtly. Like old ghosts quietly entering. Grace watched her expression carefully. Jodie stood slowly and walked toward the windows. "What do you want?" Corey exhaled shakily. "I heard about the company. That's not why you called." Another silence. Then finally, "I need help." Jodie closed her eyes briefly. There it was. The sentence she once begged emotionally to hear. Not because she wanted him helpless, because she wanted him human. Funny how timing changes everything. What kind of help I can't find work? Jodie looked down at the traffic moving far below Manhattan streets. Corey Jenkins. Once untouchable. Now unemployable. Public scandal destroyed powerful men differently than ordinary failure. Nobody wanted risk attached to their reputation. Especially not reputations involving fraud and affairs. "Corey, I know." His voice cracked slightly. "I know how this sounds." Jodie leaned against the glass quietly. And suddenly, she noticed something shocking. She wasn't angry anymore. Not really. The hatred burned itself out months ago. What remained was sadness and distance. Corey continued softly. "I lost the condo." Jodie's chest tightened unexpectedly. Not from love, from memory. She remembered the man in Boston eating takeout beside her on apartment floors while dreaming about success together. Now all his luxury had vanished. Funny. In the end, ego cost him more than poverty ever did. "What happened to Vanessa?" she asked quietly. A bitter laugh escaped him. "She left months ago." Of course she did. Relationships built through betrayal rarely survived consequences. Corey spoke again. "I just—" He paused heavily. "I didn't know who else to call." That sentence hurt in a strange way. Because despite everything, part of him still trusted her most. Too late. Way too late. Jodie looked toward Grace, watching quietly across the room. Then back toward the city. "What exactly do you want from me?" Corey hesitated. "A meeting." Her stomach tightened slightly. Not from fear. Finality. Because somewhere deep down she knew this conversation mattered. The last conversation always did. Grace mouthed carefully. "Your choice." Jodie inhaled slowly, then answered. "One coffee." Corey sounded almost relieved immediately. "Thank you." "Don't misunderstand this," Jodie said calmly. "I'm not rescuing you." Silence. Then quietly, "I know." After the call ended, Grace stood slowly. "You okay?" Jodie nodded faintly. "I think so." Grace studied her carefully. "You don't owe him closure." "I know. But maybe you owe it to yourself." That stayed with Jodie long after Grace left. That night, she walked alone through Manhattan beneath glowing streetlights while cold spring air brushed softly against her coat. The city no longer felt like a battlefield. Just a place. A place where she survived becoming someone new. Her phone buzzed again with another client inquiry, then another. Women searching for guidance, protection, proof survival was possible. Jodie smiled softly to herself. Corey once believed her kindness made her weak. But kindness wasn't weakness. Self-abandonment was. And she would never do that to herself again. As she crossed a busy intersection, her reflection flashed briefly across a dark store window. Confident posture, steady eyes, peaceful face. For the first time in years, Jodie recognized the woman staring back at her. Not Corey's wife, not a victim, not a replacement. Herself. And tomorrow she would meet the man who almost destroyed her. Not as someone begging to be loved, but as the woman who finally learned she never needed his permission to become whole. The coffee shop overlooked the Hudson River. Quiet, warm lighting, soft jazz playing low enough not to interrupt thought. Jodie chose it carefully. Neutral ground. No memories attached. She arrived first wearing a camel-colored coat and minimal makeup, her hair loose over her shoulders, while rain tapped softly against the windows outside. For a few peaceful minutes, she simply watched the river, breathing, existing. not preparing emotionally for battle anymore. That was new. Then the door opened. Corey walked in, and for one painful second, Jodie barely recognized him. Not because he looked older, because he looked humbled. The arrogance was gone. The polished invincibility, too. He wore a simple dark coat now instead of tailored luxury. No expensive watch, no executive confidence radiating from his posture. Just a tired man carrying consequences. His eyes found her immediately and softened. "Hey." Jodie nodded once. "Hi, Corey." He sat carefully across from her, like someone afraid sudden movement might break something fragile. For several awkward seconds, neither spoke. Then Corey laughed quietly under his breath. "You always hated awkward silence." Jodie smiled faintly. "I used to. Used to." The phrase lingered between them. A waitress arrived to take orders. Coffee for both. Simple. Normal. Funny how ordinary things felt unfamiliar after surviving emotional war. Corey wrapped both hands around his cup once they were alone again. "I almost didn't come." Jodie looked out toward the rain. "Why?" "Because I didn't know if seeing you would make things worse." She considered that honestly. "Does it?" Corey stared at her quietly. "No," he admitted. "It makes things real." There it was. The sentence he should have understood years earlier. Jodie finally looked directly at him. Everything between them suddenly felt visible: the love, the betrayal, the manipulation, the grief, the survival. Corey swallowed slowly. "You look happy." Jodie thought about that. Did she? Maybe not happy exactly, but peaceful, and peace felt more valuable than happiness ever did. "I sleep better now," she said softly. The honesty hit him visibly. Corey looked down at his coffee. "I deserve that." For the first time since she met him, he sounded honest without strategy attached. No manipulation. No performance. Just truth. That almost hurt more. "I spent months hating you," Corey admitted quietly. Jodie blinked slightly. "Hating me?" He nodded bitterly. "Because blaming you felt easier than admitting what I did." Rain slid slowly down the windows beside them while silence settled softly across the table. Jodie remembered all the nights she once begged this man for emotional honesty. Now he finally offered it after everything died. Cruel timing. Corey rubbed his hands together slowly. "When the company collapsed." He laughed hollowly. "I kept thinking about that apartment in Boston." Jodie's chest tightened painfully. Of course he remembered it too. "The radiator that sounded possessed," she said quietly. A real smile appeared briefly on Corey's face. Yeah, for one dangerous moment, the past almost returned. Not fully, just enough to ache. Then Corey looked at her again, and the sadness came back harder. "I loved you," he whispered. Jodie's eyes softened slightly. "I know, and that was the tragedy. He probably did love her, just not enough to stop hurting her, not enough to choose integrity over ego." Corey leaned back slowly. "I don't understand when I became—" He stopped himself. "Like this." Jodie finished softly. He nodded once. Jodie studied him carefully. "You stopped seeing people as people." Corey looked wounded by that. "Good. He should hear it." "You started seeing admiration as love," she continued quietly. "Control as respect. Silence as loyalty." Every word landed visibly, because they were true. Corey looked down. "I thought success would fix something inside me." Jodie almost smiled sadly. Instead, it amplified what was already there. Neither spoke for a while after that. Outside Manhattan moved endlessly beyond the rain, while soft music drifted through the cafe. Finally, Corey asked the question both of them knew was coming. "Could you ever forgive me?" There it was. Not, "Can we try again?" Not, "Do you still love me?" Forgiveness. Jodie stared quietly at the river beyond the glass. The answer surprised her by how simple it felt now. Yes, she said softly. Corey looked stunned. Really, Jodie nodded slowly. Because carrying hatred forever would only keep me emotionally tied to what happened. Hope flickered briefly across his face. Then Jodie continued. But forgiveness doesn't mean I come back. The hope disappeared instantly. And oddly enough, that was the moment Corey finally understood. Really understood. This wasn't temporary separation, not punishment, not strategy. Loss. Permanent loss. He looked at her for a long time, then finally whispered, I ruined the best thing that ever happened to me. Jodie's throat tightened painfully. Months ago, hearing that would have healed something desperate inside her. Now it simply sounded sad. Too late, truths usually did. You know what the hardest part was? She asked quietly. Corey shook his head. Realizing I kept shrinking myself to make you comfortable. Tears filled his eyes immediately. I never wanted that. But you benefited from it. Silence. Corey couldn't argue, because deep down, he knew exactly how much she sacrificed to preserve his peace. Jodie finished her coffee slowly, then stood. Corey panicked slightly. That's it. She smiled gently. What else is there? His eyes searched her face desperately. For love, maybe, or another chance. But Jodie no longer belonged to the version of herself that would abandon dignity for hope. Corey stood too. I'm sorry, he whispered. And this time, for the first time, she believed him. Not because he wanted something, because losing everything finally forced him to see himself clearly. Jodie stepped closer slowly, then kissed his cheek softly. Not romantically. Goodbye. I know, she said gently. Corey closed his eyes briefly like the tenderness physically hurt him. Maybe it did. Then Jodie turned and walked toward the cafe door. No dramatic exit. No revenge speech. Just peace. Outside, rain had finally stopped. Manhattan shimmered silver beneath the evening lights while crowds moved endlessly through the streets. Jodie stepped onto the sidewalk, breathing cold air deeply into her lungs. And suddenly she smiled. Not because Corey suffered, not because she won, because she survived becoming someone smaller than herself, and found her way back anyway. Behind her, Corey remained inside the cafe, watching through the window as the woman he underestimated disappeared slowly into the city without him. And for the first time in his life, he understood the difference between losing power and losing love. Some people think strength means fighting louder, loving harder, or sacrificing more to keep a relationship alive. But the truth is, real strength often begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself to protect someone who would never do the same for you. Jodie's story is not just about betrayal. It's about what happens when a kind person finally realizes that kindness without boundaries becomes self-destruction. For years, she confused patience with endurance. She believed love meant understanding, forgiving, waiting, and shrinking herself to keep the peace. But love was never supposed to cost her identity. And that's the painful lesson so many people learn too late. The most dangerous relationships are not always the loudest or most violent. Sometimes they are quiet. Sometimes they slowly convince you that your feelings are too emotional, your needs are too much, and your pain is an inconvenience. Little by little, you disappear while trying to save something that is already breaking you. But healing begins the moment you remember this: being loving does not mean being weak. Being patient does not mean accepting disrespect. And losing someone who betrays you is never as tragic as losing yourself trying to keep them. Corey only understood Jodie's value after she stopped begging to be chosen. Because people who take your love for granted often don't recognize your worth until your silence is no longer available to them. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is not destroying someone. It's rebuilding yourself so completely that their betrayal no longer defines your future. If this story touched you, let us know in the comments. What was the moment Jodie truly became powerful in your eyes? And if you enjoy emotional stories about healing, betrayal, self-worth, and powerful comebacks, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more cinematic emotional dramas like this one.